Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. Boy, we can't get the words out. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by Pastor Josh, your faithful host. How's it going? You're
Good,
you're on
Will.
mute.
Thank you.
This is the second episode where there's a long pause, a pregnant pause.
Well, you can always take out those pregnant pauses.
I won't, just because it'll make me look better, and
And me
it'll put up
worse. That's fine.
you worse. And this week we're joined by Rachel Lazar. She's the president and CEO at American United for Separation of Church and State. Rachel is a lawyer, advocate, and strategist who has dedicated her career to making our country more inclusive and has a proven track record of uniting faith and secular leaders and advocacy organizations to make tangible progress on some of the most important issues of our time. And I am so happy you're here, Rachel.
I'm so happy to be here, and I already liked you, Will, but now you pronounce my name right on top of it, and I like you even more.
There
Good
you go.
job.
That's
Good
awesome.
job.
Well, here in our podcast, we like to do our research. So I've watched other people and yourself pronounce your name because I was initially going to say laser,
Yep,
which I'm sure is how most people probably pronounce it.
indeed.
Laser, and I even like on my notes here, I have it spelled out kind of phonetically. So
Well, it's funny because when I started at Americans United, I was interviewed for a story by the Washington Post, and the journalist wrote to me and said, phonetically, like, can you give me some way of knowing how to tell readers how to pronounce your name? And the only thing that I could think of is my son. He's a big jazz pianist, and so I said, Jazzer rhymes with Jazzer, Lazar. Heard it?
Awesome. That's
That's
great. Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have it spelled out like LA-ZER, which probably isn't the phonetic spelling, but at least I know what it means, and that's all
Well,
that
it
matters.
worked. So thank
Yeah,
you.
totally. So tell us what is the Americans United for Separation of Church and State? Like what all do you guys do?
Every day, Americans United brings together religious and non religious Americans. We fight in the courts, Congress, across state legislatures, and out in the public square. And here's where I can change it up in how I describe us. So I'll give you a couple of options. We fight for everyone's right to believe as they choose, so long as they don't harm others. We fight for everyone's right to live as themselves, free from other people's religious dictates and to believe as they choose. So that's a couple of options, but another way, I'll just give you the third one, is we fight for freedom without favor and equality without exception.
Hmm, very
I
nice.
love that. I love that. Say
Okay.
that again.
Freedom without favor
Freedom
and
without favor.
equality without exception.
I like that. That's really good. How
Thanks.
long did it take you to come up with that?
That was based on our branding work that we did last year when we rebranded and
Yes,
we redid our website and we tried to kind of modernize our issue and
of course.
speak to
Right.
more people today. So it
Yeah.
worked.
I mean, I've had a few experiences of trying to come up with taglines for organizations or at our church it's building Christ-centered communities one person at a time. That's the
Yeah.
mission. So kind of one person at a time is like the tagline. But it's just I thought that man they put some thought into that to that
Thank,
mission statement tagline. So that was
thank
really
you.
cool to hear that. Absolutely. One thing you said. There's several questions, but I was really curious because of something you said. Like we want people to be able to choose what they believe, which of course that makes a lot of sense. Um, and as long and basically kind of exercise their religion or whatever, as long as there isn't harm. Now it's interesting to me because obviously harm is subject to definition and what people think harm is and isn't. And I'm sure there's legal definitions of harm. Obviously, they have to be able to say, yes, this was actually harmful in this case, which I know is I guess has been in some of the issues with what's the one we're going to look at. Well, we're going to Groff
Yes.
Yeah.
v. DeJoy, right? So yeah, I guess we've already seen that kind of idea, like what is harm. One court thought there was no harm, or they accepted what the USPS did, and the other court decided that it was wrong. They did cause harm. So what is harm Like, what do
Well,
you guys, when you're thinking about harm
yeah.
and you're thinking about in your idea, okay, yeah, we're going to take on this case and we're going to advocate for this because they've been harmed. What does that look like today?
Should I call you Reverend Josh? Rev Josh? What should I
Please
call
do not.
what should I
You can
call
just
you?
call
Josh?
me Josh. That's fine.
Josh. Well, I was just thinking about that when you were saying that, and I was thinking about how I used to talk with white people about racism, before this job,
Mm-hmm.
and I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how I would lay ground rules first for the conversations, and one of my favorite ground rule was appreciate feedback, and the reason to white people, and the reason that it was is I was trying to explain to my fellow people that when a black or brown person gives you feedback about something that you say that is offensive, that's an ouch to them. Often, all that we white people focus on is the ouch to us of that moment, right? Ouch, that hurt that you just said that.
Right,
That hurt
right,
my
right.
feelings. But actually, the person giving you the feedback was hurt more, and it's more
Mm-hmm.
risky for that person to decide to speak up and share it. I mean, it's easier for that person to just stay quiet, and by that person even speaking up and saying something to you, that is that person investing in you. But, for a lot of white people, it's hard to understand. Oh, yeah, there's someone at, like, not center ourselves. There's someone else here who was harmed even more than me. And I think a lot of what harm is about is being able to get outside of our own experience and our own perspective only, and think a little broader as to how someone else whose shoes you might not walk in might experience something. And that's what sometimes is
Mm,
missing too. That's one
mm.
answer.
Yeah, so good, so good.
Yeah, I love it. And so your organization focuses on the separation of church and state, um, which depending on who you ask, you may or may not get the same answer. So I think that there's a lot of misconceptions, maybe misunderstandings about this concept of separation of church and state, which isn't even, in the Constitution per se. So maybe you can unpack, what that really means, and address, some of the misconceptions as you know them.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, what we say is it truly is baked into the First Amendment of the Constitution, because James Madison, who worked closely with Thomas Jefferson, they acknowledged the separation of church and state. And when they wrote about the First Amendment, they talked about that separation. So what is it and what isn't it, I guess? I mean, what it's not is the idea that there is no space for religion in the public square. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings about it. Of course, people can bring their religion into the public square. That's part of who people are. And, at least I, as a church state separationist, am very for people being able to live into their true identities and their full identities. And of course, we have very multifaceted identities, but someone's religious or non religious identity tends to be an important part, of a lot of people's identity anyway. So that feels important. What it is the idea that the government can't favor one religion over any other religion or religion over non religion. And that's really clear. And that actually is written into the First Amendment in the first 16 words of our Constitution. And that promise is what protects all of our right to be who we are, live as ourselves, and not according to someone else's religious litmus test. So oftentimes when people talk about America being a secular democracy, I feel like even the word secular has, like, unfortunately taken on this sort of negative connotation, but it shouldn't, because all that it's meant to say is American democracy is based on a set of values that have had to go through the democratic process. And it's actually that translation that really matters. So I used to work for the Reform Jewish movement. I'm actually the first Jewish leader of my group in its 75-year existence, and the first female leader of the group in its 75-year existence. So change happens, which is,
Awesome.
by the way, part of why I think we're experiencing a backlash, or what Van Jones called a white lash. But we can talk about that in a little bit. But I mean, change is really afoot and
Mhm.
happening. But I think what's important is, like, you can go lobby even in Congress from your religious perspective. And I used to lead groups of Reform Jewish people who would go and say, in our faith, we are inclusive of the LGBTQ community. And that's what we think our country should be. And I'm speaking to you, as someone who may have a cousin or who's gay, but also as a Jew. That's totally
Mhm.
kosher, so to
Yeah.
speak. That's cool. What's not is a lawmaker having the laws have to take on their individual personal views and the government imposing just one set of religious views on all the rest of us, right? Because that is playing favorites. That interferes with freedom without favor and equality without exception.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, where is the line though? I mean, with, okay, so if you're going to separate church and you're going to separate state, that separation implies that there's a line somewhere. And maybe depending on the issue, that line is drawn in black and other times it's drawn in gray. and I think a lot about, just like the pandemic time, with vaccines and, and there was a big there was a lot of opposition specifically from the religious community about, you're not gonna, put those aborted fetuses in my body kind of thing, like, and it's like, I don't get it. Like, can your religion or your faith just make you so immune from the laws around you that basically you kind of have like this sort of like religious immunity from society? Like, where's the line?
Well, we think there's a really clear line, and the majority of Americans support it. In our polling, 79% of Americans agreed with this statement. Okay. Um, the law should not allow anyone to use their religious beliefs to harm others. I'll say it again. The law should not allow anyone to use their religious beliefs to harm others. That is part of how we coexist in a pluralistic society. I don't see how America can do it without that. Otherwise, we'll literally go to war. And I mean, that sounds like an exaggeration, but that is actually what happens in countries that favor one religion over others. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, that like our religious identities are so powerful that we're willing to risk our lives for them often,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know? And so I do think that the do no harm line is a great line. Now, again, we can go
Yeah.
back to what is harm, right? And the same question, Josh, the same good question that you asked, but that's where we think there's a clear, bright line.
Yeah, we're all gonna have to like all of us, you feel like would say, yeah, we don't want someone to harm someone else. And so all of us, we're going to feel like, yeah, I don't want anyone coming in and being able to harm me with their religious beliefs. So I don't want to be able to harm them. And then the difference, I think, the controversy is going to come around the definition of harm and what it means to harm someone else. Like, for instance, is proselytizing harming someone? Is, expressing your religious views in a very public way that might be, seen as prejudice or seen as not kosher, to use the word that great word. So the big thing is like, how do we actually, like, where do we define harm and things like that? And of course, that's what we've had. That's what we've had, throughout our history of the Supreme Court having to deal with these issues and make these definitions. And one thing I'm curious about is what kind of, what are some of the common misconceptions or misunderstandings do you frequently encounter about the separation of church and state? Like, maybe give us some specific, specific misconceptions that you face, and then how do you address those issues?
The number one, I'll just be bold and call it a lie about church
The
state
big lie?
separation. No.
The sort of
Yeah,
big
fine.
lie, the semi
The
big
big
lie?
lie about church state separation, fine. The big lie is that it's anti Christian and anti religion.
Mm,
That one drives me absolutely bonkers, and honestly gave me pause when the headhunter came and tried to recruit me for this job. I was like, I'm Jewish, and I'm not even a clergy, and it gave me great comfort, for example, as a religious real minority, I'm 2%, to have the previous leader, Reverend Barry Lynn, who was like a collared Christian pastor, arguing for my right, to practice and believe in the religion of my choice. So that was a big deal. The funny thing with me is I like fell into working in the religious community. I mean, I was raised a Jew. I was bat mitzvahed. I was confirmed. I loved my rabbi. He was one of the really important people in my life. I loved him very much, and he believed in me. He was like one of those adults. Sometimes like adults believe in you. You know what I mean? He was one of them for me, and his name was Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf, and he was really like a provocative thinker, and I just loved him. But that said, like, just like your average Jew, I mean, raised my kids. They were also bat mitzvahed and confirmed and all that, but not like I'm a reformed Jew. My kids were actually raised conservative because my husband is conservadox Jew. But
Hmm.
but anyway, I digress. I've really loved working in the interfaith community, like much more than I even ever realized. And one of my first faith oriented projects was when I went to this think tank called Third Way, and
Mhm.
they hired me to work on the abortion issue because I came from the pro-choice movement. And 3 days in, they were like, "Oh, do you want to run the culture program project?" And I was like, "Sure." It was like the least merited promotion ever, but I think they kind of needed a woman. But anyway, so I was like, "Sure." And I literally had this project kicked into my lap, which was, hey, evangelical Christians and progressives are doing better together, like on the environment and on things like AIDS in Africa. But otherwise, like around abortion and gay rights, there's like this huge, problem in the room every time they're together. And can you work on that? And I literally did. I worked on it. I was so stereotyping of evangelical Christians. I want to just be really honest. Like beforehand, I was like, I'm worried about this. Like these people seem really different from me. I grew up in the city in Chicago, Jewish. My parents are civil rights folks, lawyers. My dad defended the Black Panther. Like I went to protests. You know what I mean? I'm from a very different background, and it ended up being one of the most joyful like projects of my entire career. And I just learned so much and stopped stereotyping, and we found so many shared values. So it just so happens that I do love to work across divides and across different faiths, and Americans United for Separation of Church and State, to bring it back. Sorry, I really wandered there. We were founded by religious people back 75 years ago by primarily Methodist ministers, but also the head of the Southern Baptist Convention and Seventh Day Adventists and seminary deans and all sorts of religious folk. And we've always had religious folks. Actually, the chair of our board is the two-time past president of the National Council of Churches. We have a Seventh Day Adventist on the board, a Baptist pastor on the board, an Orthodox Jewish leader on the board. So we, Daphne Price, who's runs a Orthodox Jewish Feminist Alliance, because that can exist. So we really, we have a National Faith Advisory Council. And I mean, you asked Josh, like, what can we do to combat it, or what do we do? And what we're really leaning into is working with faith leaders, and continuing to put them forward as spokespeople for church state separation. For one, I'll tell you a little secret. This organization, when it was founded, had a different name. Did you know that?
No, I did not. Hmm.
So the name was Protestants and Other Americans. Hello, I'm the other. For separation of church and state. So that's what we used to be called, until like the 1960s, when we started talking about ourselves differently. I think the name was formally changed in the 1970s. But like we just brought a lawsuit in Missouri challenging Missouri's abortion ban on behalf of 14 different clergy people. from 7 different religious denominations.
Wow.
We had launched it in Christchurch Cathedral in St. Louis. It was really one of the peak days of my career. Like, I cried of we all came together and held hands and grounded ourselves, and it was like, these are my favorite moments in America, when we're coming together to stand up for the rights of everyone and, protect each other. And every one of these clergy spoke so powerfully about the importance of church and state to religion. So I think we're
Mhm.
on to something here, but I don't think that lie has ever been taken on head on. And so we are taking it on right now.
That's really so. So I definitely want to get back to what you just said about the clergy getting together to protest the abortion bans in Missouri. This is kind of a random question. Do you happen to know Brian Kaler from Word and Way?
So Brian Kaler is on our board.
I figure he was.
And he was there. He actually wrote a great article about it. He was there in the church when we launched.
Yeah, I just shot him an email this morning about something unrelated, but but yeah, he's great.
Incredible. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Christian news in the Supreme Court.
Mhm.
Recently, well, maybe like a month ago, I can't remember, but they saw a case called Groff v. DeJoy,
Mhm.
which is weird. It's a weird case for a lot of different reasons. The least of which is that DeJoy is still there. I don't really understand that one, but but let's put that aside for a minute. Can you unpack what that case is and why it was brought to the Supreme Court?
Sure. So Groff is an evangelical white Christian and a part-time postal carrier. It's called a flexible postal carrier who wanted to be able to not work a number of Sundays on his shift, and brought a lawsuit under our country's federal protection law that protects against discrimination in the workforce, saying that the postal service, by forcing him to work these days, was violating his religious freedom and Title 7 of the 1964 of the Civil Rights Act that I just described, the federal law protecting against employment discrimination. So he brought that case, and it went up on appeal. It's being defended. He's being defended by First Liberty, which is part of the shadow network of groups that are trying to codify privilege, in our view, and for white Christians into the law, and white conservative Christians into the law. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what we think, if I may, is that the fact pattern is really clear, that religious accommodation does not include the right to cause harm to third parties, meaning your coworkers or your customers, in the workforce. And here, it's plain as daylight that there was harm. It's in the record to his coworkers because they resigned, they brought grievance claims, they were also this was a 4-person office. They were also church going Christians who wanted to be able to go to church on Sundays too. And they couldn't, because he took off 24 Sundays. And by the way, I just have to mention, it's in the record that he was also, wanted to watch NASCAR on his days off, which is, okay.
Mhm.
But so, so for us, really, the case is challenging an old case that talked about where the line is for where religion needs to be accommodated in the workforce. And for us, what's clear, again, like we talked about the line, Will, earlier. So what's clear is that there should be a line that where you're really causing harm, and it's contextual, but where you're causing harm to your coworkers as you are here, that's not okay. And that's not a requirement that be accommodated, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah. So in the arguments, so I'm not a lawyer, and there's a lot of terminology and just connections that were made that were pretty unfamiliar to me, just sort of as a layperson. One in particular was they used the ADA, the American Disability Act, quite a bit, and I'm curious, like, what's the tie-in there? What's the tie-in to the ADA to religious freedom?
So it's not a tie into religious freedom. Often, what happens in the law is when you're trying to understand what a standard or words mean in one law, you look to what they mean in another law to get
Got it.
guidance. And so it was advantageous to First Liberty and to Groff to look to what the words undue hardship mean in the context of the American with Disability Act. The words undue hardship come in this way into Title VII, into this case, into the Groff case, that an employer has to accommodate someone's religious beliefs
Hmm.
unless it causes them undue hardship. Okay. So that's how the term comes into play. And in this case, it was advantageous for them to say, let's look to what undue hardship means under the ADA, because the standard's been interpreted very generously. I mean, and again, I mean, we're talking about disabled Americans who, are looking for accommodations in the workforce. What we point to, which is a really important fact, is the American with Disability Act requires that someone has to be able to meet the basic requirements of their job. That's the first test
Hmm.
before you even get to religious accommodation. And here it's obvious from the website that this job, being a part-time flexible carrier, involves having to work on shifts on Sundays. And that's part of what the whole thing is, right? To be able to fill in for those types of days. So even if you carry over the ADA standard, that's why it should fail here. But that's the rationale for why that's come into the case.
So when it gets to the appeals court or the court, like it's gotten to the Supreme Court. So what was the argument that the lower courts made that said this did cause harm, or this did, like, this needed to be something that was taken all the way to the Supreme Court? Like, what was the kind of argument that was made? You've kind of made the, explain why it kind of feels like it's a little bit off, but what's their argument for why it applies? What are they trying to
The
say that?
harm, what the harm, like why there's
So
harm.
so his harm, gotcha. So it's harming him physically because he can't make money on those days, or it's harming him because his religious violation that he has to work on a certain day. Like, what's specifically the issue?
Oh, Groff. So Groff wants to not have to work on Sundays, which are a basic part of the job. So he missed 24 scheduled Sunday shifts from like March 2017 to May 2018. And other church going Christians that were working there had to cover his shifts. And so, he then like resigned to pursue, quote, like more rewarding work service interests. And so, what he said is, it was he wasn't accommodated properly.
Gotcha. That sounded like very lawyer speak. Some kind of a what
Sorry.
interest? What did you say that? Like, that sounded like something that was like very much like created by a lawyer to make sure that, yeah, we can cover this later if or whatever it is, whatever the
You
reason.
know, I mean, he was just claiming the basic harm to himself. Like what about me? And I'm a churchgoer. And I think often what happens in these cases is, you know, we we forget that there's like it's kind of back to what I talked about when we talked about harm in the beginning. Like there's often more harm at play than we necessarily see first off.
Right.
And the thing that we often feel strongest is like the direct harm to ourselves.
Of
So that
course.
often is, paramount, and that's very human. You know what I mean? And no criticism there. It's human way.
Of
But
course. Yeah.
again, like in a pluralistic society and in the workforce and under American law, where we're all trying to coexist and work together somehow in this
Totally.
crazy experiment, which hasn't been fully realized, but we're trying to evolve. The idea is we got to take into account all the harm, and it's not just sort of like one person's harm. And I think that's a concern right now with this Supreme Court
So
because
what do you mean? Like yeah, explain what you mean.
yeah, because like what it feels like with this Supreme Court is what they keep paying attention to is only the harm to white Christians, and
Mm,
conservative Christians, and not the harm to others. So for I guess
mm,
the vaccine thing might be a bad example because clearly white conservative Christians were being harmed by avoiding the vaccine requirement and go or the church close, the temporary closure
mm.
requirement, for example, because that obviously endangered the church community in addition to the broader community.
Right.
But, it's sort of like, you know, uh, in this case, Groff was saying, well, what about the harm to me? I mean, I want to be able to go to church and watch NASCAR, but okay, but go to church,
Right.
and the others that worked with him, right, they discussed a boycott. One carrier transferred because it wasn't fair that Groff could ignore the schedule. Another carrier resigned in part because of the situation, and another carrier filed a grievance with their union. So there was a lot of harm happening to people who weren't just Groff. And again, going back to that principle that 80%, almost 79% of Americans agree with, you shouldn't be able, the law shouldn't allow you to use your religious beliefs to cause harm to others. So that's where you got to draw the line. Like,
Sure.
like if your religious beliefs, are going to create a burden, right? You can bear the burden and work on it with your employer, but you cannot cast that burden onto your coworkers.
It gets back to that almost that line that Will was referring to, because when I'm trying to process through this, right, legal reasoning is a different kind of reasoning than normal day reasoning. I've learned that. I mean, it's the same underlying
Fair,
principles,
totally.
but it's very different. So when you hear things like words thrown out there, people might, oh yeah, well, we've been talking about how long have we been talking about harm, which feels like it's a very self-evident term, and yet it can be very not self-evident depending on like how far down the line of causation you go in terms of harm and causing harm and all those different kinds of things. I My question is around legal reasoning, right? So like you're saying, this particular court is concerning because it seems like they're favoring white Christians or white evangelical Christians or whatever, whatever the term may be. But so not but you have this, this court that you're seeing as not, like you're concerned for them getting these kinds of, cases where they might just rule in favor of a certain, group without necessarily thinking about what could happen to other groups. I guess my question is like, so let's say I'll give you like a scenario. Let's say, and I've done this because in the United States, I haven't done all of this, but I've started a church, right? And all you need to start a church, the three of us could start a church, by the way. We could be on a board. The three of us, we could be on a board. It doesn't have to be a Jewish church or a Christian church. It can be whatever we want. It's a religious organization according to IRS, guidelines. We start that. Well, I guess I don't know if you live in Virginia or not, but we'd have to do a nonprofit. But even if you didn't, you could still be on the board. Only one of us has to live in Virginia. So once you do that, here's the, like, we can make this happen, but then we can write our own, constitution and bylaws. And in those constitution and bylaws, we can say in this religion, in our beliefs, we don't believe that, I don't know, working on Wednesdays, will send us to hell. So we can't work on Wednesdays. So can we, is the same thing? Can I go and create that, create this church, have these bylaws, and then work at another job, and then we're requiring me to work on Wednesday? I'm like, no, I can't do that. I won't do that. It's against my religion. And then they fire me. Can I sue them? And can I make it to the Supreme Court? And I know that's a
Well,
ridiculous thing, but what I'm
no, no,
trying to do is like,
no,
how do we
totally
actually
fair.
work through the reasoning of
Right.
bringing it to this place?
So I think there's two sort of threshold questions that I would ask to answer your question to try to put it into English, which I appreciate.
Totally.
One of them is, and I get it. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not that kind of lawyer. So the first question I would ask is, what are the very basic fundamental requirements of the job? Like if your job was to fill in for Wednesday shifts and that was what the job was, then I would say, well, you can't take that job. I don't if your religious beliefs are such that and they're sincerely held clearly and that you can't work on Wednesdays, then don't take that job, find another job because that job is a job that requires as a basic requirement that you work on Wednesdays. So that's like thing number 1.
So
And
one
then thing
second, just real quick interjection. So if say my religion says I can't eat pork or come in contact with pork, I can't try to get a job at a pork factory and then sue them because like it's against my religion or something like that to work there, right? Or like their
your job says
requirements they're not
come into
accommodating me.
contact with pork and you apply to a butcher that serves pork, you're out of, you can't ask for the employer to change his workplace that way because that's what his job is. He sells pork. So yeah, you can't, then you have to find another job.
Hmm. But I suppose just to kind of piggyback on Josh's question, because now it's got my gears turning, is like, people come into their faith at a lot of different points in their lives, some at the very beginning, some in the middle. Like I spent more years of my life as an atheist than I have as a Christian. And, so like if I made that transition mid job, how would that come into play?
Well, again, I mean, so I think, so you're asking, Will, in a way about like sincerely held religious beliefs, which we can
Mm,
talk about. Let's talk
Hmm.
about that in a minute. I'm just tabling that just for a brief second.
mhm.
Yeah,
But what
totally.
Josh was asking about was sort of also, can you apply for this job? You can't, then do you have the right to sue? And they're trying to make you work on Wednesdays and you've laid out that that's against your religious beliefs. Let's keep that scenario, Will, with your question. So
Mm,
first I'd say, if it's a job that says this is a job that is about serving meals to the homeless on Wednesdays and Saturdays or
mhm.
something like that's in the job description, those are the 2 days we have open or whatever, then you can't ask for that accommodation. That's what the job is. So that's no. Okay. But let's say that wasn't the scenario. Okay. And instead it was a job serving meals to homeless people Monday through Friday, right? And you
Mhm.
had that thing about Wednesdays.
Yeah.
What we would say is it's a very contextual analysis.
Hmm.
I mean, in Groff's case, it was a 4-person post office with other flexible carrier post office with other church
Right.
going Christians. So aside from the fact that part of the basic job was also to cover shifts like Sunday, you also had others that had religious beliefs too that,
Hmm.
needed their rights to also be respected. So, in that case, it was contextual. But in your scenario, Josh, if you applied to serve meals to homeless people Monday through Friday, and there were a bunch of people there who, and it wasn't a basic requirement, let's say that wasn't considered a basic requirement of the job. Again, like
And
missing a whole
basic
day of
is if this
exercise.
isn't here, sorry, basic requirement is this isn't here, then the job no longer exists. Or
I mean,
as it is.
everything is in courts a little more complex than that. But just to, I'm covering my tush as a lawyer, but just to be,
Yes,
just to simplify it, I mean, like
sure.
that's that's a core function of the job. So I mean, I think someone could argue, okay, well, if you're serving meals Monday through Friday, missing all of Wednesday might be a core function. But let's say you got past that, okay? Then I think, you'd have a legitimate question. Let's say there's 50 other people or 25 other people serving meals. Um, you know what? Like someone hopefully could cover your shift and, there'd be ways to, now again, I mean, are you going to cover more shifts for people? Right. So it's like fair for them. So it's not like something, those are the kinds of questions that I think you'd have to think about. But it's nice to think of a world where people can, where it's not overly burdensome on someone and people can like shift around to help each other out. Like that's the kind of country I want to live in.
Yeah.
But Will, like of course, like your question about, let's say you came there saying on Wednesdays, it's against my religious beliefs and it's part of this church that I founded or whatever. But then you became an atheist in the middle of that, right? And you no longer believe that, and you left that enterprise behind or whatever. Then no, I mean, at least this is a case that's being brought. This type of case that Josh was making, like a plain English parallel to, is being brought under Title VII's like anti-religious discrimination part clause, and therefore, yeah, like you don't have a sincerely held religious belief anymore, so you wouldn't be able to make that claim.
Interesting. So just also to kind of circle back to something that Josh had asked was, how this case made it to the Supreme Court, and I understand kind of the mechanics of how it got there, but I mean the Supreme Court has sort of broad discretion on what kinds of cases that they get to see, right? They just need like 4 votes or whatever.
Exactly.
And
Right.
I'm curious if you think that this case would have ever seen the light of day if the composition of the Supreme Court, say, was the composition circa, I don't know, 2010 or something like that,
Well,
versus the Harlan Crow court we've got today.
you know, I think this one, it's not entirely clear. I mean, I think probably not, because the facts seem very clear that there was this harm to others, but there is a lot of acknowledgement that the standard in right now in the law, the way it's been interpreted, this undue hardship language of, like if it's anything more than de minimis harm to the employer doesn't have to accommodate. That's been pretty widely criticized, or just thought that, like, even Elizabeth Prelogar, who's our solicitor general for the country, like said that the courts aren't taking that so seriously these days, that a lot of these cases go in a rule in favor of the complainant, of the worker bringing the claims. So, there's definitely an argument that it could have. The thing that's important to note is that, First Liberty really has brought a lot of cases that are being heard today. And we're living in a time, and I think this is a really interesting study. I don't know if you read about it in the New York Times, but so the Roberts Court is ruling in support of religion over 80% of the time. And
Hmm.
that's compared to about 50% of the time for all previous eras since 1953. So it's a huge jump. And whereas in the previous eras, the decisions in support of religion were almost always in support of religious minorities or those who didn't adhere to their religious denominations
Hmm.
beliefs. These days, it's been uniformly in support of Christians, and mostly white Christians. And
Hmm.
that's a really marked change. And I think that we'd be not thinking about power dynamics and how they're operating in a realistic way if we didn't sort of at least expose those numbers from that study.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess so my last question on this topic is, based on the oral arguments that we all listen to, kind of what's your sense on the way that the justices will rule?
You know, there was some surprise at the way Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh all were sympathetic to the coworkers, and the harm. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh really seemed to kind of see it in many ways. So, and this is also an interesting case, right? Because it's also where religious, like the religious interests are being pitted against business big business
Hmm.
interests. So it's a little less obvious even from a conservative perspective. And I just want to qualify. I mean, by religious interests, I guess I mean here like conservative Christian interests, because I think that religious freedom is being turned on its head by this court, and I think it's being turned
Hmm.
into religious privilege instead of religious freedom, and that's really
Hmm.
harmful to religious liberty. So I just want to be careful when we talk about like this being a case where like religious liberty is pitted against, because to me, I think there's a wolf in sheep's clothing aspect to it because of who's bringing it, because of all the harm to coworkers, and it's very clearly, I think, meant to continue this steady march of giving special privilege to sort of conservative Christianity over the rest of us. And again, I mean, I think that ultimately harms even conservative Christians, because
Sure.
I think that, in the end, like none of us want to live in a neighborhood where, we could move and there isn't true religious freedom, where like the public
No.
schools could be, like the majority of people who live in the neighborhood could be a majority who's not you. And then, you don't want your kids, for example, to feel like strangers in that school or treated worse because of their religion. So I actually worry for all of us when church state separation is undermined.
I that makes sense. Help me understand why, like the statement you made about how it's moving from religious freedom to religious privilege, feels like it's moving that trajectory with this court. Help me understand. It's interesting because I felt like it was when I was the Supreme Court during Obama's presidency, the Obama era, and then when the people he put on the
Hmm.
court, it was very popular in conservative circles. I remember this in 2015, 16, in that time, or even a little bit before then, right? In this last few years of Obama's, the second term, how much I would hear things like judicial activism, or hear things like this court is liberal and it's trying to shape the entire country towards a liberal agenda. And essentially, what I'm hearing, I mean, you didn't say that, but I could hear what you just said, and someone saying, "This this new court is trying to shape this country into the image of its creator, Donald Trump, or it's trying to it's trying to shape this country into a Christian nation or whatever it is." And I felt like I heard the same thing during Obama coming from the conservative side. I don't know if you can speak to that and
Yeah,
help me
I
even
can.
understand how is it moving in that trajectory. Help me see it.
So, okay. I have a couple of things to say about it. So I think
Sweet.
I don't I don't say this like with any malice, only with like really understanding, actually. But I think when you're accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. And so I feel like,
That'll
you
preach
know,
right there.
so I took it from the internet.
Maybe you
But
should just come on. You can preach my next sermon. I don't even, you just gave it to me for this weekend, so that's good.
Awesome. I'll come. But I feel like oftentimes, like to me, when those who have the privilege in our society are, calling something out as, judicial activism or whatever, to me, I feel like that's an example of what I just said. It feels like oppression.
Mm, mm,
So I will explain why I said that this court is turning religious freedom into religious privilege. And I'll talk about four cases quickly and without legalese, I hope, from last term. Okay, to
cool.
explain.
Yes.
So first I'll talk about the fact that the court ruled against the city last term, okay? The Roberts court ruled against the city of Boston,
Mm,
who didn't want to have to fly the Christian flag from their city hall flagpole.
mm,
And again, I mean, I know there were technical arguments here, but what I'm saying is, again, like as a Jewish person, at least, you're like, do, like walking along in Boston, and you like glance up at your like city hall building, and on your city hall flagpole, one of the three that has otherwise like the American stuff going on, and then you see the Christian flag, and you feel a little left out. Like, what is happening here? So that was one case. Another case was they forced Maine taxpayers to have to fund religious education and discrimination. So Maine had gone out of its way because of protections of religious freedom in its state constitution to say, okay, we're creating this private school voucher program, which already, I mean, we think, public schools are such a glue for America. They accept you no matter what your race, no matter what your ability level, no matter what your religious background, so we believe in them. We think it's dangerous when you divert funds away from them. But okay, what Maine said is like in certain rural areas, we have a problem because we don't have public schools. So what we're going to do is allow some money to go through to fund religious education and to parents, who can pick a private school. But we're disallowing that money from being used for religious schools because that goes against our promise of religious. We're not going to force taxpayers to fund a religion that's not theirs. I mean, that goes way back, right, to the words in the Constitution that protect religious freedom. But what this court said was, no, we are forcing Maine taxpayers to have to fund religious education, and the schools in the case actually were discriminatory. I mean, not just in who they admitted, but they had a religious litmus test. They preached against the religion of Islam. They talked about the place of women, in ways that are offensive to my religious beliefs. And so they were clearly, very much, and they were Christian schools, white Christian schools, teaching, primarily teaching, one set of narrow religious beliefs. This court forced, think about it, Muslims in the state to have to fund the education that is teaching against their religious beliefs. Okay, so that was case number 2. Case number 3, our case. So we argued against the praying football coach who was pressuring players to pray with him at the 50-yard line. And I know that's all confusing, and everybody who watches the NFL, but that's private.
Well, if I could interject for a second, that's actually how I first came to learn about your organization, and Kennedy v. Bremerton, because I moved to Virginia from Bremerton, we actually had Brian Kaler and Amanda Tyler on to kind of help break down that case. But go on, sorry.
Amazing. And I'll tell you something really interesting about that case and clergy in a minute. But in that case, the court ruled that a football coach who was pressuring players to pray with him at the 50-yard line directly following games, like at that time, I played sports. Did you play sports? Like at that time for motivational speeches, where you rally around your coach, and you're with your teammates. He was praying at that time, and there are pictures of it. I mean, that's why Justice Sotomayor, it was so unprecedented that she had to put a picture in her dissent, because she was like, what about this is private and personal and silent prayer? But anyway, the only good thing about the court buying into this set of alternate facts, which is very alarming, is that they actually didn't change the standard, because you're still not supposed to be able to pressure players to pray with you at the 50-yard line. But again, what this court was doing was thinking again about, the quote, religious freedom or the religion of the white Christian football coach. But what about the religious freedom of all those vulnerable students who wanted their coach to be on their coach's good side for a scholarship? Maybe they couldn't even afford to go otherwise to college, or to get playtime because that just makes you feel so popular, in those years, or they don't want to be teased or feel like an outsider. Those years that matters, by their teammates. So again, like the court sided with the conservative Christian, and forgot about, again, what is harm, right? And forgot about the harm to all those students, right? And I would argue that the abortion case as well, the Dobbs case that ended up overruling Roe v. Wade, was imposing one narrow religious viewpoint on all of us. So that would be the 4th case, and that's where our clergy stood up and they said, wait a minute, I'm a Methodist preacher. I'm a Episcopal bishop. I'm a United Church of Christ preacher. I'm a Orthodox Jewish maharat, the equivalent of a rabbi for a woman. I'm a Reformed Jewish rabbi. And my religion actually says that women should be able to have abortions. That's part of what my God says, and then they said, and my religion says we better be really careful about keeping a separation when it comes to government, between religion and government, because that's what protects all of our right to be religious. And I would never impose my religious views on you. Please don't impose them on me. So those are just some examples of the court playing favorites just last term 4 times.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, that's so insightful, and I want to capitalize on our discussion about the Kennedy case, because I feel like it's already kind of having some ramifications on certain legislation that we're seeing across the country, and in particular the one in Texas. So Texas proposed two bills, SB 1396 and SB 1515. One of them, I can't remember which one, was like 10 Commandments in all the classrooms, and the other one was basically public prayer, or prayer in the school. And was wondering if maybe you can comment on each one of those, and kind of get your hot takes.
Yeah, sure.
on,
My hot take. My hot take is that the Kennedy v. Bremerton case really emboldened all of these laws across the country that are um, trying to use it to justify bills that encourage public schools to abuse their power and impose religion on other people's children. And if we want to talk about parental rights, I have three kids. I mean, that is a violation of a parent's rights for sure. I mean, religion is something that is so personal to families, right? And frankly, like our Sunday schools do a great job. I'm a Reformed Jew, so we went to Sunday school too, not Saturday school, but our Sunday schools do a great job of educating our kids. We choose them carefully, right, about who's going to give religious instruction to our kids. But all across the country, we're seeing these bills now that are emboldened and trying to have the agents of state, because that's what public schools are. They're agents of the state imposing a religious view on children who are so impressionable, in schools. So, and let's just talk about Texas, as you were raising, Will. So there's the Senate Bill 1515 that would require public schools to post the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom. And they wrote their own version of the Ten Commandments. And, it's a clear violation of a Supreme Court case that's dated back to 1980 called Stone versus Graham, where the Supreme Court held that the Ten Commandments are, quote, undeniably a sacred text in the Jewish and Christian faiths, and that displaying the Ten Commandments in public schools, quote, serves no educational function. So that's one of the bills, okay? So pretty scary. Passed the Senate on April 20th, pending in the House. Unacceptable, unacceptable, clear violation. Again, whose religious freedom are we talking about, right? Let's think outside of just ourselves. Let's try to think more broadly, right? And that's who I'm talking about, like Texas parents and families. Two, you didn't mention this one yet, Will, but a school chaplain's case. So Senate Bill 763 will permit school districts to hire religious chaplains in lieu of certified school counselors. Passed the Senate April 25th. An amended version passed the House on May 9th, and it's going to conference, and then it's where they reconcile it. And again, I mean, this is where there were certain requirements about who could be a school counselor, and now all of a sudden, like the idea that you would need chaplains in schools. I mean, look, some courts have upheld the constitutionality of government-sponsored chaplains, okay, for people in the military, in hospitals, or in prisons, right? And that's where you're going to sometimes have a selection problem, like a supply problem, and there's concern about folks being able to access religious leaders. But public school students do not fit into this category. They have access to their house of worship. They can easily consult their pastor, priest, rabbi, imam, or other faith leader, or some of them are non-religious, by the way, right? A growing number of them. So it's inevitably going to lead to chaplains who are using their positions of authority, right? They're the machinery of the state to be coercive and pressure students to participate in religious activities or prayers, which brings me to the next bill, which you mentioned, Will, which is the school prayer Bible reading bill. That's Senate Bill 1396, and it would authorize public school districts and public charter schools to adopt a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious texts for students and employees. It passed the Senate on April 20th. It's currently pending in a House committee. And, here again, I mean, I just want to clarify another one of those myths. We started talking about those. Public school students have the right to read the Bible and other religious texts during free time and to pray in school. I mean, I think the joke is, prayer in school is as old as the first math test. But it has to be voluntary, non-disruptive, student-led, and student-initiated, right? So I want to be really clear, like Americans United for Separation of Church and State is not against that at all. We're happy that students get to have their religious freedom. But what we're saying is when you are clearly designing a bill to permit public schools to sponsor religious activities in violation of the Constitution, and you're authorizing schools to set aside instructional time and classroom space for prayer and reading the Bible and other religious texts, it encourages students. It's time where school employees are encouraging students to pray. And it would allow school employees to participate too, and even perhaps, according to this bill, to lead this type of prayer and Bible readings. And that's really very concerning. And again, whose religious freedom are we talking about? As a teacher, you don't leave your religious freedom at home. You can also pray, again, but it can't be coercive, and it can't be through abusing your power of the state. We actually have guides on our website for the religious freedom rights of students, of parents, and of teachers that are really user-friendly. We believe in that. We think it's important to disseminate. And then there's also a private school voucher bill, which is trying to go through too, which could cost taxpayers $1 billion by the year 2028. Again, diverting public funds to private schools, the majority of which are religious, and requiring taxpayers to fund religious education and oftentimes, not always, religious discrimination.
Wow.
Sure, that makes that's so cool. That's so cool. Go ahead, Will.
No, I was going to say, so just my last question, and I appreciate your time with us today, because you talked first about,
Absolutely.
I think you said First Liberty, and there's another legal organization that's ran by Stephen Miller and called American First Legal. And there was an article that came on the Rolling Stone some time ago that talked about them trying to dismantle the Establishment Clause. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about that, and if you guys are doing anything to help protect the Establishment Clause in this country.
I mean, we exist to protect religious freedom, and the Establishment Clause is what works with the Free Exercise Clause together to protect religious freedom. So let's just really quickly make that point, okay? Because it's like, who remembers middle school history or social studies? Not me. I don't remember learning this actually in school, but so let me just teach us all that the way religious freedom is protected in our country is by saying we have this free exercise right, this right to freely exercise our religion. Great. Awesome. That's so important. Revolutionary, right? But your right to have that freedom is restricted. And here's what it's restricted by: the right of other people to have that right. So another way to put it is your freedom to swing your fist, right? You can go out there and go swinging your fist around, but it ends at the tip of the other person's nose. And that's a quote that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to quote all the time. And that's why the Establishment Clause works with the Free Exercise Clause to protect not just some people's religious freedom, and it's really a power thing, or the religious freedom of those who have more power in our society, but the religious freedom of everyone. And it's a beautiful thing. This country, it is the first country actually that's based on the power of the people instead of the power of a deity, and people can bring their religious beliefs to their lives. Beautiful. I personally think religion adds beauty, community, and a huge value to a lot of people's lives, and it has added it to my own life, but the point here is this government is set up to put the power in the people, and its promise, not attained, but we're getting there, trying, is of equality, and you asked about America First, and they are actively trying to dismantle the Establishment Clause, and they're actually just one of many organizations. I named that billion-dollar shadow network of religious extremist groups that are seeking to undermine church-state separation in this country and to weaponize religious freedom, this beautiful thing. I got to tell you this quick story. I know we're way over time, but when I first had a classroom of kids from a college visit me in 2019, I focus grouped them and I said, what does religious freedom mean to you? What does it mean to you? They got together in a huddle and came back with a one-word answer. You ready for it? Homophobia. Now, this was on the tail of the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, right, about a baker that wanted to be able to discriminate in the name of religious freedom, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts in states that were passing to license discrimination against LGBTQ people. But how sad that this sacred principle that was a refuge to my own family and enabled us to come to this country, flee religious persecution, now synonymous with oppression and a tool for discrimination, you know? And
Yeah.
so America First is, it was started by Trump administration alumni, like 5 other groups. It's, I guess, one of 5, founded by, as you say, Stephen Miller, Trump's policy advisor, and Trump's former chief of staff too. Mark Meadows is on its board. All these groups, this is one of them, filed an amicus brief in the Kennedy v. Bremerton case against the school district, trying to protect religious freedom. And it's a very dangerous time. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of money in that movement, and a lot of fear that's been generated. You want to know what it's generated by? The first Black president. Okay, the first Black vice president and female vice president. The Me Too movement. The Black Lives Matter movement. The advent of marriage equality. I mean, honestly, change is hard for human beings. And there's been a lot of, I would argue, positive change towards a more inclusive country, but it's very understandably also stoking a lot of fear, especially for those who really did hold more privilege in society, you know? And I think that's what it's in reaction to. And you asked what we can do and how we can protect the Establishment Clause. That's what Americans United is fighting for every day. And we're actually asking people to pledge for one nation, all beliefs. One nation, all beliefs. And if you go to
That'll preach too.
Yeah, one nation, all beliefs, au.org/pledge. au.org/pledge. You can join thousands of others who are taking this pledge, because we need a national recommitment to church-state separation before it's too late, and before America doesn't even look like America anymore, because this is a foundational pillar of who we are as a country. And that's what Americans United is calling for. And I hope everyone out there, no matter what your political party, no matter what your religious background, I hope you decide to join us, because out of your patriotism, if you still believe in this country and its promises, you should be joining au.org/pledge.
Awesome. That is great. And what a wonderful way to kind of end our interview with your very convincing sales pitch. And I want to also,
and compassionate. Yes.
I want everybody listening or watching
and
this
passionate, compassion and passion, to
log in, become a member, donate money if you can, because I'm sure the work isn't free, and just help out. So thank you so much, Rachel, for your time, your expertise, your knowledge. Tons of questions we still didn't even get to that I had, but that just means that we'll have to have you on again. So
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you both so much for having me on. I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, we'll do.
Yes.
Definitely. And to the rest of our Faithful Politics audience, we will see you next week. Take care.